Good evening, I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Tonight, help for farmers battered by COVID.
We were a little bit insulted.
But some say it's not nearly enough to get food on your table.
I'm Andrew Chang. Also tonight, was COVID circulating the globe before we realized?
This gives us a whole new picture on everything.
Why a new patient zero in Europe could help in the search for a vaccine. Keeping your home virus-free can have dangerous consequences.
Accidental consumption, especially by kids, can be quite serious.
The jump in accidental poisonings during the pandemic.
I'm 19 years old. I'm a healthy guy. I didn't know at that point if I was going to come out of ICU.
I may not make it out of this.
They fought COVID and won.
I can't imagine my kids growing up without me.
From the ICU to recovery, survivors tell their stories. This is The National. The COVID-19 pandemic in Canada is slowing down. That from Canada's Chief Public Health Officer today. But the effects of the economic shutdown it prompted are not.
Food processors and farmers are among those hit hard, sparking fears about Canada's food supply. With so many restaurants shuttered, fresh food is at risk of being dumped. Add to that outbreaks at meat processing plants that are slowing production, again, leaving some farmers in the lurch. So today, some help from the federal government, a multi-million-dollar aid package. But that money, just a fraction of what the agriculture industry has been asking for. Cameron McIntosh turned to farmers today for their reaction.
Even without COVID, Boyd Penner was anticipating a rough year. Wet fields mean a late start to seeding. Prices for his corn were already down. As for his hog business, prices are so low he's not even stocking his barns. COVID is just making it worse.
Producers are going to need help here going forward.
He says what he's hearing are Band-Aid solutions for farmers.
They need to stay in business to keep feeding this country forward.
In what it's calling a first step, the government is putting up $252 million to help agriculture deal with COVID-related problems, including $125 million to keep farms going. That includes feeding livestock, $77 million for food processors to refit factories, $50 million to buy surplus food that would normally go to restaurants, diverting it to food banks. Dairy producers will also get a $200 million line of credit.
We're responding to pressing needs in terms of processors, in terms of predictability and support for farmers and for producers.
We were a little bit insulted this morning.
Beef producers say this will help feed cattle a little longer while processing plants deal with outbreaks, but won't cover mounting losses.
This money was used up about a month ago. There's no concept of what's actually happening in the country.
Overall, the agriculture sector says it needs about $2.6 billion.
It's like we have a burning building and the federal government has given us a bucket of water.
Farming is risky in the best years. This year, maybe the least certain, says Penner.
And all we do is live on hope.
With the spring planting season just getting underway, there are plenty of producers that are left out of this. The government says more help will be coming. Cameron McIntosh, CBC News, near Bloomnort, Manitoba.
Alberta is now dealing with a spike in cases at a third meat processing plant, and there are calls to shut it down until the outbreak is dealt with.
You have to give the folks the time to go through the incubation period to ensure that they're not positive for COVID-19 before they go back into that work site.
At least 34 cases are connected to the Harmony beef plant north of Calgary. The company says it has put measures in place to help stop the spread of the virus, including staggered start times and temperature checks.
Some warehouse workers at Amazon say they are worried about their safety right now, too, and their jobs if they speak out. That, as Jacqueline Hansen tells us, after an Amazon executive quit, saying the company fired whistleblowers.
COVID-19 is the biggest challenge we've had to face.
The pressure is on to ship packages safely. Amazon says it's providing masks for employees, doing temperature checks, sanitizing regularly, and taking physical distancing seriously. But some workers say they're still scared. Fears that have come true at a warehouse near Calgary where there's an outbreak. 9 cases confirmed. In Ontario, a worker told us the priority is still speed over safety.
You might be going into an aisle and there might be other people there. And if you wait before you go into an aisle to pick the item or do whatever you need to do, then that's considered punishable because you're accumulating time like that's off task technically, and they track that.
We're protecting the workers' identity because they fear they could be fired. 2 Amazon employees in the U.S. say that happened to them.
When workers aren't able to speak out, it's a disaster. We see that in
Emily Cunningham was one of 2 tech workers fired last month because she says after being outspoken on other issues, she helped organize a panel of worried warehouse workers. But Amazon denies she was fired over activism. The company says Cunningham repeatedly violated internal policies and that we support every employee's right to criticize their employer's working conditions. But an Amazon executive sided with Cunningham. Canadian Tim Bray quit over his dismay at Amazon firing whistleblowers.
I was incredibly moved that someone so high up at the company would act with such integrity.
The Canadian employee we spoke with says they aren't comfortable sharing their concerns with management.
You kind of start feeling like there's a target on your back if you speak out.
And as unemployment elsewhere skyrockets, risking a stable paycheck right now isn't an option. Jacqueline Hansen, CBC News, Toronto.
And whether it's through Amazon or the local drugstore, many Canadians are struggling to find masks, which can make things tough when more and more businesses are asking you to wear them. So, as Ellen Morrow shows us, demand is intense.
This is our improvised workshop that we have going on here.
Mariana Fernandez and her loved ones spend almost every day now making masks.
It's been busy for us.
A family business they never imagined.
So this was a way that we could, show that we care, show that we are together in this.
It all started when Fernandez's husband, a contractor, had a hard time finding a mask for work.
It's mostly for protection. We started doing this. Out of fear comes something good.
After federal advice on masks shifted, authorities now saying they can help stop the spread of COVID-19, masks have become increasingly ubiquitous. But as more and more businesses like airlines and now some grocery stores require customers to wear them, masks already scarce on the shelves are becoming an ever more precious commodity. We tried several pharmacies nationwide. Each time,
no, we're out.
You're all sold out.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, along with startups, big companies are also stepping up, like retailer Harry Rosen, donating a mask for each one purchased. For those struggling to find one, the advice from Ontario's Premier, improvise.
If you have a scarf, wear a scarf.
But remember, warn some doctors, masks alone will not stop the spread of the virus.
These are not a substitute for physical distancing measures and hand hygiene, and people should not get too comfortable and too cavalier just because they have a mask on.
Look, they look cute.
For Fernandez and her family, their mask business isn't just about helping others, it's also about coping themselves.
Instead of feeling miserable for ourselves, we're doing something to protect the community, to give it back.
Ellen Morrow, CBC News, Toronto.
Every protective measure aims to slow the spread and flatten that curve. So let's take a look at how we're all doing. The number of new reported cases peaked 2 days ago at more than 2,700, but that's because Quebec added more than 1,300 cases from April that had been missed because of a computer error. So that explains the steep drop since then. Still, well over half of today's new cases come from that same province. Quebecers are testing positive like no one else in Canada, which is why questions are being raised about Quebec loosening restrictions faster than anywhere else. Today it announced it's easing measures for people living in seniors' homes. Alison Northcott looks at the balance between physical risk and mental health.
A new sense of freedom after weeks of restrictions. These seniors can finally take a walk unattended. He says he's missed going out on his own, even just to the grocery store. Residents at private seniors' homes are more autonomous than those in long-term care, but since March, they haven't been allowed to go out alone, go to stores, or have family visit.
As long as you can have a little freedom.
For many of them, it's been hard.
Well, it's lonely because you're by yourself. You know, you can't mingle. You can't see. You see people in the hallway occasionally.
Now, the government says it's easing restrictions in homes with no cases of COVID-19, letting residents go for walks and see family outside if they observe physical distancing, wear a mask, and wash their hands. The province says it's about finding a balance between the risk of physical illness and the weight of mental distress.
We have people who even stop to eat. They want to die. They don't want to be in that situation. There is some suicides that could happen. So I think this is worse, I think, than letting people go a little bit outside.
Some homeowners say the change will be good for residents, but others worry it will open the door to the virus.
If my residents go outside unsupervised, they will go to the dépanneur, they will go to the grocery store, and they might want to see their families and hug and kiss because they're used to doing that, and they will put their health at risk.
Jan Polsky, who has only been allowed to walk here in her building's courtyard until now, hopes more restrictions are eased soon so she can finally spend time with her neighbors. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
Now in Ontario, 1 in every 6 cases so far is a healthcare worker, including those in long-term care homes.
And what we're here to say today is that there should not be one life lost.
Today, their union held protests to mark the deaths of 3 personal support workers. It wants a public inquiry into all deaths in those homes, and it's called on local police to investigate for possible criminal negligence where staff have died. On a more uplifting note, one of BC's first and worst outbreaks has been declared over, meaning no infectious cases for almost a full month. Now, since it began on March 6th, the Lynn Valley Care Centre reported 76 confirmed cases among residents and staff. 20 residents died.
Turning to Europe now, and a significant discovery suggesting COVID-19 was spreading outside China weeks earlier than we thought. Now the World Health Organization is asking countries to go back and test suspicious cases. Briar Stewart now on what that could mean for the fight against the virus.
When this 43-year-old was admitted to hospital in France in December, he had a fever and a cough. Doctors said he had some kind of viral pneumonia that they couldn't pinpoint. That was until they recently retested one of his swabs.
Positive for COVID-19.
It was positive for COVID-19. That means France had its first case December 27th, 5 days before China reported cases in Wuhan to the WHO, and 1 month before cases started officially popping up in Europe.
So this gives us a whole new picture on everything. And yes, of course, it would be great if all countries who have unspecified cases of pneumonia in the recent months would check them against COVID-19.
Sweden isn't testing old samples, but its chief epidemiologist thinks the country likely had COVID-19 cases in November. In California, recent autopsies confirmed 2 people died from the virus weeks before the first death was reported in the U.S. Canada's top doctor says the priority here is blood tests to figure out who has been infected instead of trying to pinpoint just when infections started emerging.
There's always an opportunity, I think, to sort of go back further if needed to test samples. We haven't actually, as I know it, discussed that as yet.
Viruses are elusive. They're tricky. They're hard to pin down.
This epidemiologist says in places with little community spread, such as the Maritimes, testing old samples is a good idea.
It would be great for them to reach into the freezer and go back a few months and see what specimens do they have that they could test randomly, because that would be really helpful knowledge for all of us.
And not just because it would zero in on when COVID-19 started spreading here, but early strains could help show how the virus is mutating, and that would be useful to scientists working on vaccines. Briar Stewart, CBC News, Vancouver.
Okay, so let's pick up on this with Dr. Alison McGeer, an infectious diseases specialist. Dr. McGeer, what is the potential significance of all of this in your mind?
Well, so I think the most important thing actually is the knowledge that it had already spread really before we closed borders. And it's really a marker of the fact that it's probably pointless to talk about we could have made this go away if we'd acted soon enough, because what this is telling us is the virus was out in the world a month before probably most of us suspected it was. It had already started spreading in large areas of the world, and just takes a long time for it to build up. So I think we underestimated how long it took, and then we thought, well, it didn't arrive until, later in February or March in most places, when in fact it had substantially spread around the world sometime probably late in January.
Very interesting. Okay, Dr. McGeer, thanks so much. And as we struggle to fully understand this virus, there is growing concern about another serious illness possibly linked to COVID-19, one that primarily affects children. Here's Susan Ormiston with what we've learned so far.
It's another medical mystery. Why are more children going to hospital with symptoms similar to a rare inflammatory syndrome, Kawasaki? New York's health department is alerting physicians to look for possible links to COVID and parents to be watchful for symptoms: fever, rash, severe abdominal pain, vomiting, or diarrhea.
We want parents to pay attention to when they see these symptoms, to reach out to their doctors early.
New York hospitals have identified at least 15 cases, others in Philadelphia and Boston. 12-year-old Juliet Daly had severe stomach pain. In hospital, they diagnosed COVID. She suffered cardiac arrest, but like nearly all these patients, she fully recovered.
Thank God in this situation, we haven't had any children who have died from the number of children that have been identified with Kawasaki or Kawasaki-like illness.
So far, kids have seemed more protected from coronavirus, but in Italy, France, and the UK, early concerns from severe inflammation in children.
I think it is entirely plausible that this is caused by this virus, at least in some cases.
In Montreal, doctors at Saint-Justine Hospital admitted 15 to 20 kids with Kawasaki-like symptoms whom they suspect had COVID earlier.
Maybe we are making some noise for nothing, or maybe we are just at the beginning of something bigger. We really don't know, but we have to be ready.
Working with the University of Montreal, they hope to add more data to the research into kids and coronavirus.
Yes, there is likely something, but it's not that frequent. Okay, it's not tons of patients that we have. Some patients, it was tough. Some patients had to go to intensive care unit, yes. Some patients had an inflammation of the heart, yes. But so far, to my knowledge, all of them did well.
Susan Ormiston, CBC News, Washington.
Donald Trump is thinking about winding down the White House coronavirus task force. Surprising, considering the situation in the United States. It now has a third of the entire world's caseload. More than 1.2 million Americans have been confirmed to have COVID-19. The number of deaths has passed 70,000. And as Paul Hunter tells us, new projections show that's not slowing down.
As America reopens, an undeniable reminder of the stakes. So many bodies in Brooklyn, they're being stored in a string of refrigerated trucks, waiting for places to deliver the dead. This with the latest predictions that the number of COVID deaths in America will be double previous projections, 135,000 by August. One reason? Those businesses now reopening. That's a response to the spiraling U.S. economy, but with COVID still spreading, the reopen puts countless at potential further risk. With all of that in mind, Donald Trump today took a symbolic step away from the White House to Arizona, one of the states now reopening, where he almost shook hands, but caught himself. Trump was in Phoenix in part to tour a face mask company where he encouraged those moves to reopen.
We can't keep our country closed. We have to open our country.
This as word the White House will soon disband its coronavirus task force, likely by the end of the month. Trump was asked, with COVID still rampant, how is this a good time for that?
You could say there might be a recurrence, and there might be, and most doctors or some doctors say that it will happen, and it'll be a flame, and we're going to put the flame out.
Earlier came word Trump will allow a key task force member, Anthony Fauci, to testify before a Senate committee controlled by Republicans. But he blocked Fauci from doing so before a Democrat-controlled House of Representatives committee. Why? Said Trump.
The House is a bunch of Trump haters.
Meanwhile, a whistleblower complaint today from the former head of a federal agency developing drugs to combat the coronavirus. Demoted, it says in the complaint, for trying to put science ahead of politics in raising concerns about the White House approach on all of it. Paul Hunter, CBC News, Washington.
75 years ago tonight, Canadian soldiers liberated the Netherlands from the Nazis.
We can still carry that torch of remembrance.
Up next, how both countries found ways to commemorate the day amidst the pandemic.
Plus, what's it like to have a serious case of COVID-19?
I didn't know at that point if I was going to come out of ICU.
Frightening first-hand tales from recovered patients.
And the long-term care workers who moved in.
They don't have their families, and we just wanted them to have the normal.
We're back in 2.
While the world seems on hold right now over COVID-19, Canada is still campaigning for that UN Security Council seat up for grabs in June. And as Salima Shivji tells us, the pandemic is now playing a role in that bid.
It seems like a lifetime, but it was really only 3 months ago that this was how Canada was campaigning for a UN Security Council seat.
People look to Canada as a trusted partner.
Like most other things these days, the pleading for crucial votes is now virtual. But networking on Zoom actually has its upsides.
It allows us to reach more people without having to go very far.
And Canada is very much leaning into the coronavirus crisis, trying to use the pandemic to show this country, a G7 and G20 member, can bring allies together when others are faltering.
The best campaign is then we don't need to campaign, is when we just show by our leadership that this is the type of voice that you would want at the Security Council.
Note the recent push from the European Union to fund vaccine research.
It is so good to have you with us.
The Prime Minister was there, promising money already announced.
A global crisis requires a global response.
Right after one of Canada's rivals for the rotating UN seat, Norway, pledged far more.
And Canada is stepping up to do its part.
But that's Canada's perennial problem. Its part lags behind others on aid and peacekeeping too, where Canada is dwarfed by its other competitor, Ireland.
Our failure on that front is our most serious Achilles heel in seeking the seat.
Making the revamped pitch more complex, the optics of promising virus recovery aid elsewhere when so many Canadians are struggling. And so the message is careful.
As part of our commitment to the world, but it's also in our very, very selfish national interests, because when you're around that table, you're more influential.
The ambassador is popular and maybe the Liberals' trump card in the behind-the-scenes game. But if Canada loses, it will be seen as a failure for this Liberal government, even in these unprecedented times. Salima Shivji, CBC News, Ottawa.
An apparent murder-suicide just east of Edmonton has claimed the lives of 3 family members.
I can confirm that a mother and daughter died as a result of homicide, and the male as a result of a self-inflicted injury.
Friends and family have confirmed Greg Gartner and his wife Lois Patterson were among the dead, along with their 13-year-old daughter. The couple's teenage son is said to have been the one who called police yesterday morning. Loved ones are remembering Sub-Lieutenant Matthew Pike, one of the 6 Canadian Forces members killed in a helicopter crash. In a statement through a spokesperson, family members say the 34-year-old died doing what he was born to do.
He fell in the line of duty for his nation, a finality which deeply aligned with his ethos of honor and helping others before self.
Pike is missing and presumed dead after that cyclone chopper crashed off the coast of Greece last week.
The pandemic almost sidelined a milestone in the history of the Second World War, but never the deep bonds between Canada and the Netherlands.
On this day, we remember the Canadians and Newfoundlanders who liberated the Netherlands from the tyranny of the Nazis.
It was 75 years ago that Canadian forces rolled in, liberating a country that had endured years of brutal occupation. Ceremonies to mark Liberation Day usually draw thousands, but this year's was attended only by the King and a few dignitaries. In Ottawa, the Peace Tower Carillon rang with music from Dutch composers. The Tulip Festival was cancelled, but flowers are still in bloom. Aaron Collins now on how the efforts to mark Canada's sacrifice have moved online.
It was a moment few could forget. The Dutch people freed from the yoke of Nazi occupation, cheering on their liberators. But Canada paid a high price for the Netherlands' freedom. Thousands of our soldiers were killed. A sacrifice the Dutch haven't forgotten, but COVID-19 forced the cancellation of major events at cemeteries across the Netherlands to mark the 75th anniversary of their liberation, replaced by small groups placing tulips at gravestones. This Canadian living in the Netherlands was there. She also prepared a museum exhibit to mark the day.
Of course, because of COVID, the museum is closed, but it will go online, and then as soon as the museum is open, people will be able to go and visit.
And it's not the only online project commemorating the lives of Canadian soldiers. This website documents the personal stories of Canada's fallen. Many of the volunteers who put the website together were to meet at Grosbeek Cemetery today. That can't happen, which makes their virtual memorial even more important.
Having Faces to Graves is an opportunity to share our story virtually, whether it's during the COVID crisis or not.
Donna Maxwell has researched hundreds of the Canadians buried in the Netherlands, many for the Faces to Graves project. She was to be the guest of honor at their ceremony today. Now she'll connect online.
There's a few at the cemeteries that I'll probably try to Skype so that we can share a few moments together and I can see where they are in their projects.
Karen Hunter was supposed to be in the Netherlands too. She had planned to lead more than 150 people on a march that followed the path Canadian troops took in 1945. Now that journey has moved online.
We can still carry that torch of remembrance for our veterans, and we can try to help dispel the extreme disappointment on both sides of the ocean.
Those committed to remembering Canada's fallen soldiers say they'll be back in the Netherlands once the battle to defeat COVID-19 is over. Aaron Collins, CBC News, Calgary.
A Second World War vet living in BC has found a way to serve during this moment in history.
How does it feel?
Good.
Feels good?
Do another lap.
While the pandemic keeps his family apart, he's keeping busy by giving back. John Hillman's story in our moment.
And as we do, we are taking your COVID-19 questions tonight. Here's one of them. Is the virus mutating? That very suddenly became a very important question today. The answer after this. Welcome back. It is that time in the program where we answer your COVID-19 questions. And joining me tonight with her advice, opinions, knowledge, infectious diseases specialist, Dr. Alison McGeer. Dr. McGeer, always a pleasure to have you here. Let's start with this first question. It's a pretty straightforward one, but a hard one. When can I hug my grandkids? And I suppose that's going to depend on where in the country you live.
The answer is not soon enough. Yeah. I think for everyone who has grandchildren, it is going to depend on where you live in this country. It is going to depend very much on what happens in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we start to move gradually into releasing restrictions. So really all you can say is please try to be patient a little longer. We do know how hard it is. But we've also watched Italy and New York City, and we also know how hard the alternative is.
Right. Another question. Is the virus mutating?
That's a really good question today, because just today there's been this whole series of papers out about a major mutation in what's called the spike protein, the protein that sticks out of the virus and binds to cells. That's generated a lot of discussion about whether virus that has that change in it is actually more transmissible or maybe more virulent. I don't know the answer yet, but it's really the first time that we've seen a mutation that looks like maybe it has some importance. And that's obviously a concern. We've been very worried about whether this coronavirus can mutate and become different over time. And there's kind of good news, bad news. Okay, it's good news that it's 4 months before we saw the first thing. Bad news that we've seen it now. Again, we really don't know where this is going. We don't even know if this mutation is truly important, but we don't have any idea of the speed with which this virus is going to change over time.
Right, because I wonder, is that a setback for all the work on developing a vaccine?
Well, yes and no, probably not. I mean, I think everybody's going back to look at their vaccines and to ask whether that change is going to make a difference to how well their vaccines work. But in general, the people who've been working on vaccines know this is going to happen. So this is not unexpected, and I don't think it's at a level that's going to set back anybody's vaccine development plans.
Okay, Dr. McGeer, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much. So as we've mentioned, we will be asking your questions about COVID-19 as often as we possibly can, so keep them coming. Message us directly on Instagram at CBC The National, or send us an email at covid@cbc.ca. Just put The National in the subject line. Now, we are learning more about COVID-19 every day and how people get infected too. Experts generally believe airborne transmission is unlikely, but 2 new studies are suggesting it isn't so black and white. Nicole Ireland explains.
Most experts agree that COVID-19 spreads through droplets when people come in contact with each other. Those droplets fall to the ground quite quickly. That's why staying 2 meters apart protects people against infection, but sometimes even smaller droplets become aerosolized or airborne and travel further. Researchers in China say they detected traces of coronavirus in bathrooms in high-traffic areas in Wuhan hospitals that got there through the air. Although we have not established the infectivity of the virus detected in these hospital areas, their paper says, we propose that SARS-CoV-2 may have the potential to be transmitted via aerosols. But what they detected were simply pieces of the virus's genetic material, and with no evidence they were still infectious, experts say the findings don't reveal anything new about transmission.
Does it mean that COVID-19 is spreading from person to person through aerosols? And I would say definitively not. It doesn't mean that.
The idea of airborne spread is scary because it would mean someone could catch an illness after an infected person left a room. Highly unlikely with COVID-19, says Dr. Alison McGeer.
If this were usually or most commonly transmitted by the airborne route, then we would know it by now.
That's because viruses that are truly airborne are extremely contagious. A prime example, measles.
If we had an outbreak of measles and we sent non-immune healthcare workers into those rooms wearing a mask, if they spent an hour in the room, they would all get infected.
That hasn't happened with the thousands of healthcare workers around the world treating patients with COVID-19. So instead of worrying about getting the virus through the air, experts say, we can protect ourselves by continuing to follow public health rules, such as physical distancing and hand washing. Nicole Ireland, CBC News, Toronto.
Well, next on The National, gripping stories of sickness and recovery. Meet survivors of serious cases of COVID-19.
But first, in tonight's pandemic diary, what it's like to manage a grocery store right now.
I'm Antonio Leto, store manager at a Metro in Toronto. Our day has changed drastically. It's a very stressful time. It's an exciting time. We're performing for the community. I guess that is the satisfaction that gets us through the day. Some days are really long and endless. Right now, sometimes you're walking into the unknown. You're kind of getting that feeling in your stomach even before you're walking in the store.
Morning, Carol. Morning, Adam.
I think a lot of people don't understand what retail employees go through. They might think that the grocery store retailers are exempt from the COVID-19. I don't come to work thinking, you know what, today I might contract COVID-19. I come in very positive and I try not to let it affect me.
More than 26,000 Canadians know firsthand what it feels like not just to have COVID-19, but to beat it. That is the number of confirmed recovery cases in this country. We know the virus affects people differently. Many people get a mild illness, but you're about to hear from some who were hit hard and lived to tell their stories.
I'm Dr. D.N.A. Favit, and I'm 66 years old. Practiced emergency medicine in the Windsor area for over 35 years. Prior to getting sick, my plan was to work the COVID clinic. I had got my privileges reinstated at the hospital, I said, okay, I'll work the COVID clinic, and I was waiting for the schedule before getting sick.
So I'm at University of Calgary. I'm a business major with a focus in human resources. I usually live on campus, like in a dorm. My name is Matt Greenshields. I'm 19 years old. I'm from Okotoks, Alberta. In my spare time, I like to play a lot of sports. I usually play volleyball specifically, and then beach volleyball.
So I'm a stay-home mom. I used to work in a bank, but then when I had my kids, and when I found out that my son has autism, so I dedicated my time for them to help them. They're 4, but they're turning 5 this end of May. My name is Julian Lingen. I'm 39 years old, a wife, and a mother of twins.
There was one case at the school that was confirmed in my business program, but they said that person hadn't been on campus much at all. So I must have just, in the business building, touched the wrong doorknob and then wiped my nose or something, just some freak accident that I never saw coming.
I contracted the virus from my husband.
I knew things were going downhill because I just couldn't breathe. And I had a little bit of cough, and I could feel a little bit of a wheeze. And my wife didn't like the way I was looking.
I had fever. It was high fever. I started coughing. I'm taking Tylenol and Advil, and it doesn't really help me at all.
I got very, very nauseous, and I had a coughing fit where I coughed up a lot of blood. And then that's when we pulled the trigger and said, there's something wrong, and it's not just a common cold.
I can't even talk, and by walking even one step, I'm already catching my breath. My husband drove me to the hospital. I didn't even hug my children that time, because what if it's really COVID?
The day after I tested positive for COVID, the news broke to me that I tested positive for mono as well. And the nurse came in and told my mom, he tested positive for coronavirus. And then she told my mom, you have to leave right now.
I actually asked them to intubate me because I said, I just can't breathe. This is crazy. It's the worst feeling in the world. I didn't realize till afterwards, but the doctor told me how severe it was when he said, with your chest x-ray, your age factor, he says, your morbidity was about 80%.
On my way down to the intensive care unit, when I was being wheeled through these hallways, I was it's quiet. I'm with my thoughts, and I'm thinking, I'm 19 years old. I'm a healthy guy. I didn't know at that point if I was going to come out of ICU.
And the scariest part was that thinking that I'd have to put my mother through something like this, my wife and kids, that, I may not make it out of this.
I basically fought for love. I can't imagine my kids growing up without me.
You saved my life, just like God touched you.
When the frontliner did my grand exit, that was really unexpected. So it made me realize that, my condition was really serious. I'm really thankful. I'm so grateful for them.
The day I left the hospital, they said, he says, I don't see any more reason to keep you here. I said, perfect. I gave my wife a call and I said, can you come and get me in 45 minutes? We turned the corner going down my street and I says, well, there's your cousin. And I go, and there's a friend of mine and another friend of mine. Even now I get all choked up about it.
First, I didn't want to come forth and explain my story because I didn't want to scare anyone. I was made aware of some people my age who were still hosting events and still hosting small house parties, and people captioning their posts as, COVID's got nothing on me. And I was like, COVID does have something on you.
It's hard on everybody. Businesses, I'm sure all the parents out there have exhausted every means of trying to entertain their kids. This virus is so unpredictable. So I'm really concerned that if they open up too soon in lifting some of the restrictions, that we may have a second surge, because this virus is deadly and it can turn in a heartbeat.
Next on The National, warnings after a huge jump in household poisonings. How to keep your house clean while keeping safe. From burning eyes and trouble breathing to children drinking hand sanitizer. Some Canadians trying to keep their homes COVID-free are accidentally poisoning themselves with cleaning products. Rosa Marcatelli has more on the spike in cases and how to disinfect safely.
I'm going to talk to you about the danger of accidental mixing of different kind of household disinfectants.
Longtime health inspector turned health consultant Jim Chan has seen it all over the years.
A lady used mixing vinegar and chlorine bleach in a bucket. Try to clean the carpet at home. End up in the hospital because there was a large volume of chlorine gas being manufactured. In a more serious case, that could be fatal.
Calls like that to poison centres across the country have jumped from this time last year. According to Health Canada, February and March recorded a 58% increase in reported poisonings related to bleaches, disinfectants, hand sanitizers, and chlorine and chloramine gases. Cases where people mix the wrong combination of cleaning chemicals or accidentally ingest them.
Health Canada says it's happening for a few reasons. More cleaning products around the house as people stock up. More exposure to those products as people clean and disinfect more often. And many of us, including children, are spending a lot of time at home.
Okay, you guys, when Mommy's cleaning with a red bucket, what do we know? Red means stop.
Kate Wallace is well aware of the dangers and takes precautions to keep her two young kids safe, while also trying to keep the house virus-free.
They're at that age where anything could happen in a couple minutes still.
1/3 of a cup of bleach.
Chan says avoid mixing bleach with anything but water and make sure young kids don't get a hold of alcohol-based hand sanitizers.
Accidental consumption, especially by kids, can be quite serious.
With so much misinformation online, Chan says Canadians should follow advice on how to thoroughly and safely clean and disinfect from reputable sources like government websites. He recommends the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Rosa Marcatelli, CBC News, Calgary.
Okay, remember Captain Tom, the Second World War vet, raised millions for the UK National Health Service? Well, next, meet John Hillman, another vet living in BC who's picking up where you left off. But first.
Staff at this seniors' home in Quebec made an extraordinary sacrifice to keep COVID out, leaving their own families behind and moving in for a month.
They don't have their families, and we just wanted them to have the normal. We went to bingo with them. We'd get them laughing. We had our walks outside. We could be in contact because we were all clear after our 14 days that we could hug if they wanted to hug somebody, someone to talk to. It went very well.
Staff returned to their own families this past weekend. Rolf says she was happy to be home, but leaving the residence is wrenching.
These people are special, and it's time for them to have their care. It's not as hard as people seem to think it is. It's love.
Remember this man? Well, last month, Captain Tom Moore walked the lengths of his UK garden, raising over £32 million for the NHS. Now, John Hillman, a 101-year-old veteran living in BC, is following in those storied footsteps. So Hillman has pledged to walk 101 laps around his garden of his BC retirement home, averaging about 5 laps per day, all with the goal of raising $101,000 for charity, and that is our moment.
I was very impressed by watching Captain Tom on the British news, and then I thought, well, I'm 101. I've served a very full and eventful life. I think it's about time I did something back. I've always thought during the war I had an angel sitting on each shoulder looking after me. At 101, it's a good walk to be doing.
There you are.
We have a goal of 101,000 to equal my age. That's the goal. I'll keep going as long as I can.
Lovely. How does it feel?
Good.
Feels good?
Do another lap. Do another 5.
Another 5.
So What you should know about John Hillman is that in the Royal Air Force, he was a permanent flag sergeant. This is also a man who's been married to his wife for 78 years. She moved into a care home just before COVID. He used to take a bus to go see her 4 times a week. He can't now, so all the love he's getting back from everyone else there matters a lot.
Yeah, well, and I gotta say, anyone who hits the ripe old age of 101 and says to himself, hey, I still think I have something I need to give back to the world, that's a guy that's A-OK in my book. That's The National for this Tuesday, May 5th. Have a good night.
Good night.